Hello everyone, my name is Wade Sokolosky, author, research, tour guide of anything just about related to the 1865 Carolinas campaign. And today, the short video clip we're shooting here at Bentonville Battlefield State Historic Site. I'm going to briefly discuss the Confederate Army of Tennessee, the bringing of the Army into the battlefield here, and ultimately their last grand charge of the Army of Tennessee. Now, to kind of set the conditions here, how did they get here? On the early morning hours of March 18th, Wade Hampton sends a message to Confederate General Joseph Eggleston Johnston, whose headquarters is about 18-20 miles north of here at Smithfield. And Hampton makes the recommendation that this is a great place for a fight. We've got Sherman's two wings are separated. This is an opportunity for us to attack one of them and then see how successful we are, then maybe move on the next one. Johnston very quickly agrees with that. Now, the first major commands that he has that he can order down here from Smithfield are the Robert Hoke's Division from the Department of North Carolina and the Confederate Army of Tennessee. Now, General Hardee's command from Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, although Johnston thinks he's a lot closer to Bentonville, but the reality is he's much farther away. So the first two major units that will arrive here are Hoke's and the Army of Tennessee. In early morning hours of March 18th, between 6:30 and 7:30, a series of orders will go out to the various subordinate commanders from Johnston, ordering Hoke and A.P. Stewart down here to the Battle of to the Bentonville Battlefield, what ultimately turns into the Bentonville Battlefield. Now, that's by evening hours. Hoke is in the lead. Hoke will arrive, but by late evening hours on March 18th, the Army of Tennessee has reached the little tiny village of Bentonville, which is about 2.5–3 miles from here. They will encamp during the night, and then on the early morning hours of March 19th, they will begin to file into the wood line here, basically to my front. Now, I think it's important that we pause for a moment, because I'm saying Army of Tennessee. When you look at the total number of soldiers throughout the three-day battle from the Army that fight here, is approximately 4,500 men, and understand some are still going to arrive on the 20th and 21st. But when I say Army of Tennessee, understand that Robert Hoke's division, which is deployed off over here blocking the old Goldsboro Road, is essentially larger than the entire Army of Tennessee. So that kind of gives you a picture. If you go back to General Hood's Tennessee campaign, the Battle of Franklin, followed up by the Battle of Nashville, and then the Bloody Winter Retreat, where literally the Army of Tennessee is in the lion's mouth. They eventually reach down into northern Mississippi around Corinth and Tupelo. And then it's towards the end of January that President Davis, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, will order the transfer of a good portion of the Army of Tennessee towards the Carolinas, because Sherman just captured Savannah. So President Davis is under a lot of pressure to do something. And the Army of Tennessee will begin that long journey, like I said, at the end of the month, all the way through the Deep South, through various railroads, marching overland a little bit, but they will start to arrive here, and Johnston has selected Smithfield as a point of concentration for all these various forces that he is trying to gather here at this time. I like to, when the Army starts to begin to move in here, I do have a quote from Thomas Jefferson Corn from the 32nd Tennessee from Palmer's Brigade. I like sharing the actual soldiers' words, because you can't get no better than that. He said, "On the morning of March 19th, just before daylight, I was awakened from the heavy firing in our front." And what Sergeant Corn is talking about is the delaying action by Hampton's cavalry off here to my rear, back towards the Cole Plantation, and ultimately towards where the Bentonville Battlefield Visitor Center is. The cavalry is trying to delay and buy time for these forces to get down here from Smithfield. Every man was up instantly and in line. There was an old field just in front of us. We entered it in a few steps, moving by the right flank, and just as we entered this field, General Johnston passed us on the right. Although we had orders to be very quiet, the men cheered him, and he raised his hat in recognition of us. The enemy was very near, and hearing the cheering, they commenced shelling us. And just at this time, orders was given to go in line on the right by file into a line of slow movement under fire without any excitement. Sergeant Corn's statement here is interesting because we know General Johnston is obviously on this part of the battlefield early morning of March 19th. He also alludes to the cannon fire. Those cannons are coming now from Lieutenant Scoville's battery from Illinois back towards on the other side of the Cole Plantation, just south from here. What's interesting, those Federal gunners have observed two Confederate artillery batteries off over here to my right that belong to Wade Hampton. And it's during this time of exchange of gunfire between these batteries that one of the first general officers wounded during this battle, Daniel Reynolds from Arkansas in the Confederate Army of Tennessee, who happens to be sitting on his horse Bob when poor Bob takes a 3-inch Hotchkiss round straight through the breast, exits through the horse's side, carrying away most of General Reynolds' leg, and which will later require total amputation. And unfortunately for General Reynolds, he's out for the rest of the war. He's ultimately sent to the Raleigh Hospital, and by the end of the war, he's in a hospital in High Point, North Carolina. But with General Reynolds being out of the fight, I introduced Colonel Henry G. Bunn, who happens to be one of the regimental commanders in his brigade. And I would like to read an account here as Colonel Bunn describes the battlefield as he sees it right over here in off to my rear here. Colonel Bunn wrote of the Battle of Bentonville was in many respects the most peculiar it was my fortune to see during my 4 years of service. There was an old field extending from north to south. I'm looking north, south is over my shoulder, or nearly in that direction lengthwise. It appeared to be 200 or 300 yards wide. It was comparatively free from undergrowth, at least towards the northern end. But as he continues to talk, as we look towards the tree line in the distance, as the ground will eventually start to go down, we get into that particular part of the battlefield called the ravine, which is very significant on March 19th. Now, Bunn's account is good because literally we're looking exactly what the Army of Tennessee is seeing on the morning of March 19th from this particular part of the line. Understand, as the Army of Tennessee continues to flow in down the road, they're going to hang a right off the main road, and they're going to continue to file off into the distance. Brigade arrives, next brigade comes in, the next brigade comes in, as they leapfrog to the right, and they will eventually extend to this line a good distance. But understand, folks, this is not the Confederate Army of Tennessee from the Atlanta campaign. We're only talking about 4,000 soldiers that will be here present on the morning of March 19th. So throughout the morning of March 19th, the Army of Tennessee would file to the right into the wood line here to my front. As the Army deployed, the series of trenches that remain today, which is a wonderful piece of the battlefield here, historic site for preservation, we know that the Army of Tennessee deployed in a first line of entrenchments and then a second line several hundred yards towards the rear. Now by mid-morning, the Federals to my rear are still kind of scratching their head on what's out here. Of course, they're under the belief throughout the morning that it's nothing but dismounted cavalry. So obviously, you know, from the sergeant and lieutenant perspective in the ranks, there's a lot more out here than just dismounted cavalry. So later on towards noon, the Federal forces on this side of the battlefield will execute a kind of reconnaissance in force towards my front here to try to determine exactly what is here. And I'd like to pick up Henry G. Clayton, who was a division commander in the Army of Tennessee. I'd like to read his account here from that morning. On the morning of 19th, this division went into line of battle near Bentonville on the right of the Corps and the Army. I deployed skirmishers upon my right and adopted the other usual precautions to protect flank. Having been informed that the line would probably be changed, I delayed constructing breastworks. Skirmishing in my front became very heavy. I ordered breastworks to be made. About this time, Govan's brigade, another Arkansas bunch, went into position on my right. Govan's brigade is from Pat Claiborne's old division. We had only time to throw together a few rails and logs, and when a few minutes before 12, the enemy made a vigorous attack, mainly upon my front, but extending a short distance to my right and left. They were almost handsomely repulsed, with a loss of about 25 dead, among them a major and a number of wounded, with a few captured and unhurt. My own loss did not exceed 10 killed and wounded. What General Clayton is describing is that reconnaissance in force by the elements of General Carlin's Federal Division to my rear. When he refers to Major Eaton, he's talking about Major Eaton from the 14th Michigan. If you visit the State Historic Site, the museum there at the Visitor Center, there's a great reproduction of the headstone that was made for Major Eaton after the 19th, when his body was buried right out here in the open field here behind me. Now, it's also important to note during this reconnaissance, as we look to, at the time, several galvanized Yankees, which are former Union soldiers who've now volunteered to dig entrenchments or whatever, and what the Confederates call, in the latter part of the campaign, the 1st Foreign Battalion. At this time, several of those soldiers would take the opportunity to escape to their friendly lines to my rear. And ultimately, as those prisoners are passed up the chain of command, luckily one of the staff officers at the left wing headquarters recognizes one of the individuals. Is more like, "Hey man, what you doing here? Where you been?" And he realized this guy's for real. And it's during that time there that they realize it's not dismounted cavalry. It is the General Johnston is gathering the entire, concentrating the entire Confederate Army right here at Bentonville, and from that point on it takes a different stage for the Union. I'm standing here in the Army of Tennessee trenches on the far right of the line. The very beginning of my video was the start, and roughly 3/4 to a mile in length during the morning of March 19th, the Army of Tennessee would occupy this entire line here. This is one of my favorite spots on the battlefield here at the State Historic Site. Well-preserved trenches, but more importantly is you see a perfect example here of the original revetment log that was thrown up by the soldiers when they were digging these trenches. It still remains here today, 156 years ago, from now when we're shooting this video. But it's important to understand that now the battle at Bentonville is 3 days long. These were not all constructed on day one. Those soldiers are here through the 21st. So in essence, you're looking at about 3 days of digging with about 156 years of erosion and leaf fall and stuff like that. But like I said, you get a wonderful example here of the trenches here dug at the battlefield. But more importantly, this is the end of the line for the Army of Tennessee. And later on, General Bates, after doing his reconnaissance, will recommend that the William Tolliver's division fall in over here on over my left shoulder to further extend this line here before the actual charge starts at 2:45. All right, picking up on the last grand charge of the Army of Tennessee, we're here at the far right flank of the Army, which was essentially those elements from former Cheatham's Corps, Frank Cheatham's Corps, under the command of General William Bates, who people called him Old Grits. Being on the right flank of the Army, the scheduled time was about 1,400 hours for the Army of Tennessee to begin its last grand charge across the open field to my rear. But being the good general that he was, he kind of made a reconnaissance, and I like to read that portion to you here so you kind of understand why ultimately the Army of Tennessee's charge is delayed for approximately 30 to 45 minutes. I received orders from Lieutenant General Hardee in person early in the afternoon to advance and to attack the enemy in my front, having just returned from a close and accurate reconnaissance in which I ascertained that the left of the enemy's line, at least his front line, did not extend connectedly at all beyond my right, and there being a division, General William Tolliver's division, whom he's referring to, laying in reserve in my immediate rear. I urged that it make a detour passing beyond my right and thrown upon the left flank of the enemy. This was adopted, and the time advance deferred about half an hour. that the flanking division might get into position before the front attack was made. Now, General Bates' account is important for two things here. One, what he's saying is, upon his personal reconnaissance, what you do when you attack, you really want to overlap the enemies. And what he has observed is the far right of his command here, Captain Bonner's brigade, from the division there, if it attacked at that moment in time, essentially its right flank would be exposed to the enemy fire coming from Buell's brigade off over here from Carlin's division. So what General Bates recommends and Hardee approves is General William Tolliver's division. Finally, General Hardee's forces that had fought at Aversboro figured out the errors in their map, and they're now starting to arrive on the battlefield. And when Tolliver's division deploys onto this part, it's put in a reserve behind the Army of Tennessee. And what Bates is getting permission to do is essentially move William Tolliver's division off over here to my left into the open field to extend the line. So once the attack begins, this time means Tolliver's division is overlapping the flank of the Federal Brigade, Buell's brigade, off here to my shoulder. Earlier in the video, I read you an account from Colonel Bunn from Reynolds' brigade from the initial start point. And as he described the field out in front of his brigade, as he talked about the south end of the field, there was a ravine. Immediately over my shoulder, as you see how the ground slopes downward towards the creek and ravine at the bottom here, is that once the Army of Tennessee launched its attack at 2:45, and it swept away the Union defenders from the opposite side of this ravine, those Union defenders from from Buell's brigade and half of Hobart's brigade are swept up this face of the ravine here, up in there towards, as a retreat back towards the Morris Farm. And as the Army of Tennessee continues to push in this direction, it's at this time, as those veterans, as they near the crest here and they look out into the open field, they see 4 12-pound Napoleons, and they also see General Robinson's brigade from the 20th Corps that's arrived here to shore up the center here of the line. And immediately a lot of these veterans here have a flashback from Franklin, Tennessee. And at this point that they pause for a moment, but it's also where we see excellent leadership on the part of Lieutenant General William Hardee, who commands this part of the battlefield for General Johnston. And as the Army of Tennessee's attack is somewhat stalled here, as these soldiers seek shelter here where it's obviously safe, it's General Hardee at this moment, upon his horse, he will ride out into this open field. General Hardee, alone by himself, on his horse, will ride out into this open field here, demonstrating to his soldiers that it's okay, as he waves his hat. And the Army of Tennessee is spurred on based upon his demonstration of some great leadership. The Army of Tennessee will emerge out of this ravine and sweep towards the 4 guns from Lieutenant Webb's battery from the 19th Indiana. They will push across this open field, capturing 3 of the 4 guns that are here. And they push on towards General Robinson's brigade, which is a little bit of high ground on the opposite side of those trees that you see in the distance. And it's at this point in time, General Robinson, who had just arrived, and he has kicked out a few skirmishers here around these guns, and when the Army of Tennessee emerges. But for General Robinson over there from the Union side, over here towards his left, Buell's brigade is swept away and ultimately gives up that part of the battlefield. And as the Army of Tennessee comes out of this ravine to my rear, they're now threatening General Robinson's over there, pretty much come around his left flank and his rear, and it forces General Robinson to give up the battlefield right here in a fighting withdrawal back towards the Morris Farm. In the meantime, the Army of Tennessee will continue this sweep towards this direction here as we head to the high water mark of their charge. I'm standing on one of the newest trails that's recently been put in here at Bentonville State Historic Site, which opens up the North Carolina Junior Reserve part of the line from Hoke's division. My focus is on the last grand charge of the Army of Tennessee, but it's on the afternoon of March 19th that the North Carolina Junior Reserves, from their position here in their trenches, will observe the Army of Tennessee come out of the wood line. And to these young boys, Junior Reserves are 14, 15, 16-year-old boys. They've never seen anything like it in their life. I think it's the coolest thing ever, as these regiments come out of the wood line in the last grand charge of the Army of Tennessee. The wood line to my rear, from the North Carolina Junior Reserve position from where we're standing here, it's that wood line there that the young boys observed the Army of Tennessee come across out of the woods, across the field, in parade ground fashion, which they found so, like I said before, pretty cool. The sad part about the Army of Tennessee, as I discussed before, is their strength is so small. They're smaller than Robert Hoke's division. But the young boys are fascinated by it. But it's the senior officers that are over here, they feel a little bit of sadness, because as that Army of Tennessee emerges out of that wood line in that parade ground fashion, they see the regimental colors flapping in the breeze. But the problem is the regimental colors, and the senior officers pick up on it, is the simple fact that they're too close to one another. The 48th Tennessee, for example, out of Stewart's Corps, AP Stewart's Corps, barely 24 men are in that wood line, but they're still proudly carrying the colors of the 48th Tennessee at that time. So it's a really cool vista from this point, as we can see, because earlier, one of the videos I shot earlier was from the far right flank of General Bates there, when he moved William Tolliver's division in. You can see that portion of the battlefield from here. And that gives you a great perspective on just how far along the Army of Tennessee's last grand charge was.